Imagine an island no bigger than a football field, yet home to over 1,000 people, isolated in the vast Lake Victoria. It's not a city, nor does it resemble any typical settlement. This is Migingo Island, a tiny space that constantly challenges the limits of size, resources, and human habitation. Here, seemingly illogical things become commonplace. A crowded, cramped community, yet filled with countless unbelievable stories. In this video, we'll explore 15 unique things found only on Migingo Island. Watch until the end, because the final detail might give you a completely different perspective on the island. Number 1. The ultimate human experiment in survival skills. Migingo Island is so small that on a map, it almost disappears into the water. The total area of the island is less than 5,000 square meters, equivalent to less than 0.5 hectares. A standard international football field is about 7,000 square meters, and Migingo is smaller than that. If you were to shrink it further, the entire island would only be enough for a five-a-side football match, and no more. But what makes Migingo unusual isn't its size, but the fact that over 1,000 people cram their entire lives into this space. There are no suburbs, no transitional spaces. Houses are built close together, pathways are barely wide enough for one person to squeeze through, and all activities overlap. An area that's a walkway in the morning is used for mending fishing nets at noon, and becomes a place for conversation in the evening. In the middle of Lake Victoria, nearly 69,000 square kilometers, Migingo is like a piece of rock swallowed by the water. But the paradox lies in the fact that this very smallness creates an extremely high density of activity. Sound doesn't dissipate, but is trapped by the surrounding lake. Conversations, metal clanging, waves, and wind blend together into a continuous layer of sound. At night, the fishing lights surrounding the island form a distinct ring of light, making Migingo look like a luminous point in the middle of the lake. According to field observations, the concept of private space is almost non-existent in Migingo. Many houses are only a few square meters, enough to fit a bed, a small kitchen, and basic necessities. There is no room for parks, greenery, or proper communal areas. Any changes, from adding a wall to placing a table, require negotiation because every square meter directly affects those around. Migingo is more than just a place to live. It is a living experiment on how humans adapt when space is limited to the extreme, and when every decision about daily life comes at the cost of cramped conditions. What do you think about over 1,000 people living in an area smaller than a football field? If you had to live in Migingo for a month, what would be your biggest challenge? Number 2. An island that survives thanks to a species of fish. Migingo Island's livelihood depends on fishing, and more specifically, on Nile tilapia. Here, fishing isn't just one of many economic options, but the sole foundation. Most households on the island are involved in this chain, either directly or indirectly. Some fish in the lake, while others stay behind to process, sort, refrigerate, and sell the fish. When fishing is interrupted, there are virtually no other alternative sources of income to sustain life on the island. The fish that makes up Migingo is highly valuable due to high export demand, particularly to markets outside Lake Victoria. Mature Nile tilapia typically weigh between 10 and 50 kilograms, large enough to yield a significant profit per trip. The fish are refrigerated immediately upon arrival using ice imported from the mainland and then sold to intermediaries. This chain requires rapid processing, as even a delay of a few hours significantly reduces the fish's commercial value. Fish prices fluctuate with the seasons and yields, but it remains the primary source of income that allows many families to stay on the island for extended periods. Fishing in Migingo doesn't require complex techniques, but it heavily depends on timing, experience, and endurance. Each trip can last for hours on the vast lake, nearly 69,000 square kilometers, where the weather changes rapidly and is difficult to predict. Fuel costs, ice, and boat maintenance make profits unstable. There are periods when people have to accept consecutive losses, waiting for a large catch to recoup all expenses. Therefore, income isn't calculated daily, but over longer cycles. Fishing also shapes the entire rhythm of life on the island. Daily life, buying and selling, and eating all revolve around the boats leaving and returning. The familiar sounds of Migingo aren't car horns or bells, but the hum of boat engines, the sound of fish being placed on wooden platforms, and the clatter of stones against buckets. Fishing is not just a means of survival for Migingo. It dictates the timing, pace, and manner in which this island operates each day. Number 3. living in the middle of a lake but lacking water. Migingo Island is situated in the middle of Africa's largest freshwater lake, yet drinking water has never been readily available. There is no established water supply system on the island. There are no pipelines, no large central reservoirs, and no exploitable groundwater sources. Water is therefore not considered part of the infrastructure, but rather a link in the logistical chain, similar to fuel or food. The main water source comes from rainwater and transport from the mainland. During the rainy season, households make the most of their rooftops to collect rainwater. Crude pipes carry rainwater directly into plastic containers or tanks. When the rain is consistent, this amount is sufficient for basic needs for several days. However, rainfall is inconsistent, and prolonged dry periods quickly empty the tanks. During those times, rainwater is no longer a backup source, but becomes a crucial factor in the daily lives of the entire family. When rainfall is insufficient, water must be transported by boat from the lakeshore or from safer locations. Each trip typically involves carrying containers of about 20 to 30 liters. The cost of water is therefore not only the purchase price, but also the fuel, time, and effort involved. According to field observations, many households have drastically reduced their water use for laundry or personal hygiene to prioritize drinking and cooking water. Other needs are not completely eliminated, but are used to a minimum. Living amidst a freshwater lake while meticulously calculating every drop of water creates a unique rhythm of life. Water is not wasted, not because of regulations, but because every drop is linked to a specific transportation process. When the water supply is interrupted, the impact spreads rapidly, from household activities to trading, fish processing, and even maintaining hygiene on the island. This makes water one of the most fragile elements in Migingo life. How do you think living in the middle of a freshwater lake but still having to carry water back in cans would change your daily routine? If the water supply were interrupted for a few days, what would be affected first on Migingo? Number 4. An island living off the power grid. Migingo Island is completely disconnected from the national power grid. Electricity on the island comes from fuel-powered generators and lighting systems used for fishing. There is no single electricity source for the entire island. Each cluster of houses, shops, or group of boats must organize its own power supply, making electricity use decentralized and directly dependent on affordability. A small generator on Migingo typically has a capacity of 2 to 5 kilowatts, enough to power a few light bulbs, charge phones, and operate basic equipment for a short time. Fuel must be transported from the mainland by boat, consuming about 1 to 2 liters of diesel per hour. Due to high costs, many households only turn on their generators for 2 to 4 hours a day, mostly in the evening. Therefore, electricity for daily use is intermittent and not considered a given. In contrast, fishing lights consume a larger amount of electricity, but are almost always prioritized. A night fishing boat typically uses 10 to 20 high-powered lights to attract small fish. During peak season, dozens of boats operate simultaneously, illuminating the area around the island on the lake. Field observations indicate that fuel used for fishing accounts for a significant portion of the island's total daily fuel consumption. This distribution creates two parallel realities. On the lake, lighting is maintained consistently to ensure livelihoods. On the island, many areas are plunged into darkness when generators stop working. Residents are accustomed to charging their phones, cooking, or conducting business according to the hours when electricity is available, not following a fixed schedule. When fuel is scarce or transportation is disrupted by weather, electricity for daily use is often cut off first, while fishing continues as it remains the primary source of income. Electricity on Migingo is therefore not just a convenience, but a resource that must be allocated strategically. Prioritizing lighting for fishing reveals what directly sustains the island's existence. If you had to choose, would you prioritize electricity for daily life or for livelihood? How would living in a place where lighting needs to be carefully calculated down to the hour force you to change your daily habits? Number 5. The one who stays behind the lights. On Migingo Island, women's roles aren't defined by specific occupations or social positions, but by a repetitive daily routine. On this cramped island, they don't participate in night fishing, but they are the ones who keep the day running smoothly. Their lives operate on a steady, quiet rhythm, rarely recognized. Most women handle essential logistical tasks. They cook, do laundry, care for children, clean, and prepare household supplies. These tasks have no fixed schedule. The day usually begins very early and ends only when the island is shrouded in darkness. The small living space means all activities take place in the same area. Sleeping is also cooking. Small stalls also serve as living spaces. Some women find ways to earn income by selling prepared meals, dried fish, or essential items. The scale is very limited and primarily serves the surrounding community. Income is irregular and difficult to accumulate. According to independent surveys, many families on Migingo have to carefully budget their expenses on a daily basis because their income depends entirely on fishing and small-scale trading. Some days, sales are quick. Other days, there are almost no transactions. The cramped space makes privacy a luxury. Women spend most of their time in or in front of their homes, where all their activities are easily visible. When families are large, they often have to reduce their personal needs to make room for their children or relatives. Many women have to adjust their rest times to the family's schedule rather than their own needs. A less discussed factor is the ability to leave the island. Not all women have the means to travel frequently. Going to the mainland requires money, time, and careful planning. In reality, some only leave Migingo a few times a year, or even less, confining their lives to a very narrow space. Major changes therefore occur slowly, if at all. The women on Migingo don't appear as symbols or central figures. They exist in the gray area of island life, where responsibility outweighs choice, and stability is always temporary. How do you think long-term living in such a slow-changing environment impacts one's perception of the future? If daily life is more tied to responsibility than opportunity, would you adapt or seek change? Number 6. A temporary space for real life. In Migingo, infrastructure isn't designed for long-term development, but for immediate survival. Almost the entire surface of the island is covered in corrugated iron roofs and metal walls, built so close together that there's no natural space left. The scarcity of land forces all structures to be small, low, and compact. Most houses are only large enough for a few people to sit or lie down, and often serve multiple purposes simultaneously: sleeping, storing belongings, and providing a temporary resting place between fishing trips. Building materials on the island revolve almost entirely around corrugated iron, thin wood, and lightweight steel. The reason is very practical. These materials can be transported by small boats, assembled quickly, and replaced piece by piece when damaged. In return, thermal and sound insulation are virtually non-existent. During the day, heat is trapped under the corrugated iron roofs. At night, conversations, music, and generator noise spread throughout the island. The living environment is therefore not only cramped, but also constantly noisy and hot, forcing residents to adjust their daily routines to the surrounding physical conditions. It is noteworthy that Migingo still maintains communal living spaces. There are grocery stores, dry goods stalls, ice vendors, and small entertainment areas. These places are often just narrow spaces with a few lights and speakers, but they play a crucial role in maintaining the rhythm of life. When housing lacks sufficient space for social interaction, these common areas become the only places for the community to meet and relieve stress. Common spaces thus become part of the spiritual infrastructure, no less important than electricity or water. The infrastructure in Migingo has no room for redundancy. Everything operates close to its limits. A major storm, a small fire, or a shortage of repair materials can quickly spread into a shared problem for many households. Efficiency here doesn't come from durability, but from the ability to continuously repair, patch, and adapt to inevitable damage. Number 7. A community that compensates for limited space. On Migingo Island, living conditions are not judged by the size of the houses, but by how people share space. On a rocky outcrop of only a few thousand square meters, more than 1,000 people live together every day. This means that most houses on the island are only a few square meters, enough space for 1 or 2 mattresses, a few personal items, and almost no room to move around. The huts are built so close together that the gap between 2 walls is sometimes only a few dozen centimeters. Those inside can clearly hear their neighbors' activities, from conversations to the sounds of preparations before a trip to the lake. Privacy in the conventional sense is virtually non-existent. Instead, residents learn to regulate their behavior, speak more softly, manage their schedules, and accept that their lives are always under the observation of others. A house is often not just for one person. Many families have 3 to 5 people sleeping in a cramped space. As the population increased, daily life shifted outdoors. The walkways between the rows of tents became places for cooking, socializing, mending fishing nets, or resting. In fact, many activities that would normally take place indoors on land were now entirely outdoors on Migingo, as this was the only way to alleviate space pressure. Shared spaces thus became more important than private rooms. It's noteworthy that despite the cramped conditions, Migingo rarely descends into chaos. This is due to interdependence. When people live too close together, prolonged conflict quickly impacts work, trade, and livelihoods. Maintaining harmony becomes a pragmatic choice, not for the sake of community ideals, but because everyone needs others to continue living and working. Living conditions on Migingo are uncomfortable, but not entirely bleak either. It's a form of adaptation, where community and shared space compensate for the lack of individual space and privacy. In your opinion, will living in an environment with almost no privacy make people more connected, or simply exhaust them over time? If you had to choose between a large but isolated space and a cramped but communal space, what would you choose? Number 8. Life is being eroded by costs. Migingo Island faces not only a sovereignty dispute, but also incurs tangible and measurable daily living costs. According to local fishermen, to be allowed to anchor and operate around the island, each boat typically has to pay fees ranging from $20 to $50 per month, depending on the time of year and the controlling party in the area. Given that the average fisherman's income is only about $6 to $10 per day after deducting fuel and ice costs, this is a significant burden. In addition to anchoring fees, there are also variable security and control fees. At times, fishermen report having to pay an extra $1 to $3 for each docking. If they make multiple trips a day, this quickly erodes their profits. These fees often lack receipts or a stable rate, making it difficult for fishermen to plan their finances for more than a few days. Paperwork also becomes a form of indirect cost. Fishermen often have to prepare various documents to deal with inspections. Renewing or unofficially renewing paperwork can cost several dozen dollars extra each year. For many families, this amount is equivalent to a week's worth of income from a successful fishing trip. Because of the high legal risks, many choose not to invest in larger boats. A small motorboat on Lake Victoria costs between $800 and $1,500, and spending that much becomes risky as no one can be sure that fees and operating rights will remain the same in the long term. These overlapping costs don't stop Migingo from operating, but they keep life in a precarious balance. Income from fish can surge on a good day, but is easily eroded by these additional expenses. For many families on the island, the goal isn't to accumulate wealth or expand, but simply to maintain the ability to go out onto the lake the next day. Number 9. The island with no police. On Migingo Island, law enforcement doesn't exist as a system of authority, but rather as a social mechanism based on credibility and timely intervention. The island doesn't have a fixed police station in the conventional sense. Instead, order is maintained by individuals recognized by the community, often elders or long-standing influential figures who act as mediators when conflicts arise. The process is relatively simple. When disputes occur, from minor altercations and financial disagreements to personal misunderstandings, the situation rarely escalates into prolonged confrontation. Parties involved are typically referred to these respected individuals to present their cases, receive analysis, and get advice. This process doesn't rely on written laws or formal penalties, but rather on consensus and social pressure. In a space where people interact daily, being ostracized by the community means losing the support necessary for daily life. This method of handling conflicts is somewhat effective because the relationships on the island are complex and difficult to separate. A troublemaker faces not just one individual, but an entire network of buying, selling, living, and supporting each other. A negatively judged act can directly impact subsequent business dealings, exchanges, or receiving assistance. Maintaining harmony is therefore more pragmatic than idealistic. However, this mechanism also reveals limitations. It works well with minor and familiar conflicts, but lacks clear procedures for serious situations or when personal interests outweigh public opinion. In those cases, order depends more on the persuasive abilities of the mediator than on a fixed principle. Law enforcement on Migingo is therefore not an absolute guarantee, but a fragile equilibrium maintained through compromise and mutual oversight. In your opinion, can a system without an official police force but relying on community credibility maintain long-term stability? If you had to live in a place where the law depends more on people than on written documents, would you feel safer or more insecure? Number 10. The border shifts on the water. Migingo Island is known not for its size, but for the long-standing sovereignty dispute between Kenya and Uganda. The core issue is not the small piece of land itself, but the control over the surrounding fishing grounds. Lake Victoria is a vital fishing area for East Africa, and a shift of just a few hundred meters on the waterline can significantly alter access to the fish stocks. Tensions became apparent in 2008 when Ugandan security forces established a regular presence on the island and collected fees from fishermen. Kenya protested, claiming Migingo was within its territory. During the most tense period, both sides maintained control, resulting in multiple layers of parallel management on a small promontory measuring only a few thousand square meters. While not erupting into military conflict, this situation created lasting instability. Following bilateral negotiations, the two countries agreed to temporarily co-manage activities on the island while continuing to survey and demarcate the lake's boundaries. However, defining the boundaries on a vast body of water spanning nearly 69,000 square kilometers is a complex technical and legal problem. Different measurement results can lead to differing interpretations, making the dispute difficult to resolve definitively. For the residents of Migingo, the dispute is not a distant geopolitical issue. It manifests itself in who collects fees, which documents are recognized, and which forces control access. Fishermen may have to pay fees for the same activity, depending on the time and which side is present. Their livelihoods are therefore directly affected by decisions made hundreds of kilometers away from the island. A small rocky outcrop, thanks to the surrounding fish stocks, has become a crossroads of regional economic, security, and diplomatic interests. Number 11. Living where there's no one on emergency duty. On Migingo Island, healthcare doesn't exist as a complete system, but rather as a makeshift response to emergencies. There are no proper hospitals, no fully equipped emergency rooms, and no permanent medical staff. When an incident occurs, the first instinct is often not to seek a doctor, but to find someone experienced in handling the situation. Common health problems on the island include minor injuries, skin infections, fever, stomach aches, or accidents in the cramped space. With a high population density, even a small wound, if not treated properly, can become serious. First aid relies primarily on personal experience, over-the-counter medications, or word-of-mouth advice. Appropriate medications aren't always readily available, and post-treatment follow-up is almost non-existent. The most dangerous situations are those requiring emergency intervention. To access medical facilities on the mainland, patients must wait for boats and are entirely dependent on the timing and conditions on the lake. Waiting times can last for hours. In severe cases, this delay creates a fine line between recovery and complications. Not everyone has the financial means or physical capacity to undertake an emergency trip, especially at night. The lack of formal medical care has fostered a practical, preventative mindset in Migingo. They strive to avoid risks, minimize actions that could easily cause injury, and address any unusual symptoms early. This isn't an ideal solution, but rather an adaptation to an environment lacking medical support. Medical care in Migingo, therefore, isn't about treatment, but about minimizing risk in a place where professional assistance is always delayed. How do you think living in a place where emergency services can't arrive immediately will change how people face risk? If every incident requires you to handle it yourself first, will you be more cautious or accept danger as a part of life? Number 12. Live within sight. On Migingo Island, security doesn't come from armed forces or official surveillance systems, but from the fact that no one can simply disappear. On an island of only a few thousand square meters, where over 1,000 people live together, every movement is easily noticed. Who goes where, stays with whom, and returns at what time is naturally known. This cramped space creates a passive form of security, requiring no formal organization. There are no police stations in the conventional sense on the island, yet serious violence is rare. The reason isn't in the laws, but in the interdependence. Social relationships are tightly interwoven. People can be neighbors, customers, sellers, or share living space. A prolonged conflict will quickly escalate and directly affect daily life. Therefore, minor conflicts are usually resolved quickly. Security on Migingo also relies on familiar faces. Strangers are infrequent and easily recognizable. This doesn't require complicated paperwork or procedures. The mere appearance of a new face is enough to draw attention from the community. The control is therefore more social than administrative. As night falls and the lights dim, the island doesn't fall completely silent. Small groups still chat or sit by the lake. The constant human presence creates a sense of being watched, making extremist behavior less likely. Security on Migingo isn't about absolute safety, but rather a fragile balance maintained by the forced closeness between individuals. In your opinion, would living where everyone knows what you're doing make you feel more secure or more suffocated? If there were no police but a constantly watching community, would that be enough to maintain long-term order? Number 13. A community formed through endurance. On Migingo Island, the community isn't formed by individual choice, but by the forced coexistence of living in a space that doesn't allow for separation. Perched on a small rocky outcrop in Lake Victoria, the residents come from many different parts of East Africa. They differ in background, language, and customs, but share one thing in common: cramped living space and interdependence. The Migingo community operates in a highly pragmatic way. When space is insufficient for each person to have their own, resources must be shared. Water, electricity, and living space are allocated according to habits formed over time, rather than formal regulations. Those who overuse resources are quickly reprimanded, without the need for paperwork or clear penalties. In a small space, community pressure is often more effective than rules. Cultural diversity doesn't make Migingo a place of constant conflict. On the contrary, it fosters a coexistence based on compromise. People learn to avoid unnecessary conflict, as prolonged disagreements make daily life more burdensome. When faced with the same person every day in the same narrow passageway, compromise becomes a necessary skill. Besides daily activities, small gatherings take place regularly. These aren't festive occasions, but simply moments to relieve stress. In a constantly crowded environment, these shared moments help the community maintain balance. The Migingo community isn't romantic, nor is it entirely warm. It's a way for people to learn to tolerate each other and coexist in a space where no one can truly stand outside. In your opinion, would living in a community where the distance between individuals is almost zero foster stronger bonds or simply teach silence? If you had to share almost everything every day, what would be your biggest challenge? Number 14. The island that lives suspended in mid-air. On Migingo Island, the state of temporary is no longer a short-term phase, but has become a long-term way of life. Almost everything on the island is built with the assumption that it can be dismantled, replaced, or patched up at any time. Houses are made of corrugated iron and thin wood. Narrow pathways are pieced together according to immediate needs. There is no overall design for the future, because even the present is always subject to change. This ephemeral nature doesn't stem from carelessness, but from the context. When land is limited and control and regulations are always ambiguous, investing in sustainable things becomes an unacceptable risk. People are accustomed to repairing damaged parts instead of building new ones, reinforcing weak points instead of undertaking complete renovations. In reality, many structures on the island are repaired several times a year, each time just enough to continue use, not to ensure long-term longevity. Therefore, all decisions are short-term, focused on getting by day to day. Living in this state for an extended period creates a unique form of adaptation. People rarely plan far ahead, not because of a lack of willpower, but because the environment doesn't provide the impetus for it. When everything can change without warning, stability becomes the most fragile thing. Life gradually becomes measured by very short milestones, such as a few trips to the lake, a few weeks of trading, or a successful fishing season, instead of long-term goals spanning years. It's noteworthy that this prolonged transience doesn't cause Migingo to collapse. The island continues to function, maintaining its own rhythm of life and relatively stable social relationships. But the price paid is the lack of a clear destination. Migingo exists in a state of limbo, where maintaining the present is more important than striving for a different future. Familiarity with transience reduces the sense of urgency to change, while blurring the concept of long-term development. Migingo, therefore, is more than just a place where people live temporarily. It is a place where transience has become the norm, and that raises larger questions about the limits of human adaptability. Number 15. Living in a place not meant for humans. On Migingo Island, the strangest thing isn't the people, the conflicts, or the survival methods, but the fact that the island still exists. Migingo is so small that on many maps it appears only as a faint dot or even unmarked. There are no favorable natural conditions, no planning, and no clear reason for it to be a permanent settlement, yet people have clung to it for many years. The origin of Migingo has never been unanimously explained. Some believe it's simply a rocky outcrop rising from the bottom of Lake Victoria. Others suggest it formed from the accumulation of sediment and material over time. Whichever is correct, Migingo is clearly not designed for human habitation. It lacks arable land, a stable natural freshwater source, and space for expansion. Most of the fundamental elements for a sustainable community are missing, or only exist temporarily. Yet people remain. Not necessarily because it's safe, nor because it's ideal, but because Migingo has become a temporary anchorage that has lasted far too long. Successive groups of people arrive, stay, erect temporary structures, form temporary habits, and gradually normalize the temporary. The island's existence doesn't stem from a strategic decision, but from a series of short-term choices superimposed over many years, each seemingly reasonable in its moment. Migingo challenges the familiar assumption that humans can only sustain themselves in suitable places. Here, life thrives not on favorable conditions, but on continuous endurance and adaptation. But adaptation, when prolonged, can also become a hindrance to change. When the temporary becomes commonplace, the need to seek a different future fades. Migingo exists, but its existence is not accompanied by a clear promise of tomorrow. The island stands on the fragile boundary between human adaptability and the limits of that very adaptability. And perhaps it is this very precariousness that makes Migingo so peculiar. In your opinion, how long can a place that shouldn't exist, according to conventional logic, last before reaching its limit? If adaptation becomes the sole reason to stay, is it still a choice or merely a circumstance? If today's exploration of Migingo has made you pause and reflect on how humans survive in places not designed for long-term habitation, please like and share your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think Migingo is evidence of humanity's extraordinary adaptability, or a sign that endurance is being stretched beyond reasonable limits? And if you were in that situation, would you adapt, or would you try to leave? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to continue our explorations. We will continue to seek out lands beyond familiar maps, communities existing on the edge of living conditions, and stories that are difficult to categorize as right or wrong. The world still holds many places that challenge the assumptions we often take for granted. Thank you for watching until the end. See you again on the next journey, where each destination is not just a landmark, but also an open question about how humanity exists in this world.